Okay, so thanks for everyone for joining for this session. Uh, I'm I hope you have some experience with PAM, but even if you don't know privilege access management, I think this next 40 minutes will help you ramp up quickly on what is privilege access management and how you should approach to privilege access management. So I will move to a full screen mode and in between shuffle. So hope that's okay. So before I start, a bit about me because this is the first time I'm attending this event and I'm from India, Bangalore. I'm currently working as a leader for IAM globally for NXP. It's a semiconductor company. Also, I do a lot of, I'm very passionate about volunteering and being part of communities, and that's the reason why I'm here. I've been leading the CSA Bangalore chapter. CSA is Cloud Security Alliance Group. And the best way to reach me is through LinkedIn. And I'm very responsive to anybody's messages there. So I want to get started on this topic real quickly. So when I say, are you doing your PAM right? It's a very bold statement, right? And people will think, well, I have a tool, I have funding available, and I just want to get my PAM done. But then I just want to step back and check if you are doing your PAM correctly. Now, 2018 and 2019, we have Gartner rated PAM as the top security project, right? And continuously in 2 years. And if I look at this time, what they have rated is they're talking about remote workforce, they're talking about cloud security posture management, talking about passwordless, which I'm going to connect of how they are related to your privileged users and why your PAM needs a refresh, right? The whole program needs a refresh. Also, a few numbers which are appearing, and then these numbers are quite intimidating and make us think through what we are doing wrong. What I want to talk about is 80% of our security breaches are due to secure privileged credentials getting compromised, and this is from Forrester. 90% of our organization are scared of insider threat. They are vulnerable to insider threat. And 49% of organizations don't have policies defined for privileged user access. So these numbers do look scary. And while organizations have PAM products, tools, processes in place, but they are still failing and still at high risk. So with these facts, I want to get started with PAM. And my presentation is structured around these topics, and I will take them segment by segment so that we are clear. But before I do a deep down on these topics, if people are unfamiliar about what is privilege access, so privilege access are those access or those users who have those access which are considered privileged in your environment. When I say privileged, they are the super users. They are the administrators of your Windows, Linux environments. They are the administrator or the maintenance people for your social security um, accounts. They also, so when I say social security, it's social websites. They're also critical administrator of your applications, right? So these are the people who are considered superhuman beings in your environment. So I'm talking about how do we manage access for these users. Now, if I get started with my first topic, right, when I'm saying not prioritizing correctly, let's look at what do I mean by that. Now, many privilege access management project which I have seen and I have implemented a few is they mostly focus on platforms. They talk about I have a Linux server, I have a Windows server, and then can I just vault their passwords of privileged users? Can I just, my databases are the high critical ones? No, I think while they are critical, applications are very, very critical, and you cannot move applications to later phases. So you have to do a risk assessment of what is the most critical, and in that most critical list, application should be part of it. What people generally forget is your cloud, right? We are, I think, with COVID and multiple things, we are moving very big bang on cloud now. And how are we going to protect the cloud privilege access, right? The management consoles, the people who have access to the key management consoles of the cloud. We cannot make it an afterthought. It has to be decided right up front so that you have the right tools, processes, and people to implement those. And also, have you thought about the company's social media account, right? So a very good example is somebody can, with his privilege access, can go and maybe deactivate a critical account, or maybe defame your company's fame in their social media account. So social media account is also a very privileged user, and we have to make sure we are taking care of that in your PAMS program. So what do we do? How do we proceed and make sure we are prioritizing it correctly, right? So my first suggestion is to make sure you do your risk assessment very correctly. That's the first step before you start your PAM journey. Make sure you know what is critical to your organization. And then your onboarding schedule should be based on the risk assessments, based on criticality, right? And since risk assessment involves business, I'm sure you are having business people included as part of your onboarding schedule. Also, don't forget about your cloud, any third party applications, SaaS applications. What we are also looking at, integrate with your DevOps, and DevOps is becoming as alarming as possible because it has keys to your code, and we definitely need to protect those users who can deploy code, right? So think upfront about how you are going to secure your DevOps privileged users. Now, a lot of PAM should be implemented within a year. It should not take you more than a year to get the benefits out of your PAM solution. Now, a lot of companies struggle with onboarding, right? So their onboarding process goes months, maybe 6 months, year, maybe crossing a year. So my suggestion here is maybe you should look at how you automate your onboarding and avoid such long running programs to onboard. The quicker you onboard, the quicker you realize the benefit. So I'll take a pause and go back to questions if there are any. And I'm sorry. Okay, great. No questions. So that's my first step. And of course, RPA and bots are coming into your environment. We cannot forget about them. We have to think through of what we are going to do with them in your PAM program. So please think ahead of these technology revolutions which are coming in place, and you cannot make it an afterthought and leave them for later. The next topic which I'm going to talk about is also in line with Gartner, and in some of the topics about being passwordless is what I'm going to cover. Now, we all know, or at least I know, I don't like passwords, right? My phone does not use passwords anymore, and every day I don't have to enter a 8-digit or 12-digit password to get inside my phone, right? My company recently also became passwordless, so I don't have to enter passwords to start my work. And believe me, it's such a relief. And some metrics which I have here, which shows you how passwords are bad. I will also talk about passwords. Passwords were meant for traditional computing systems where we have maybe a client server architecture, right, where you store the password in the server and the clients can authenticate. But the world has changed, right? We have now cryptography keys which can be used. We have uh, devices which are user having multiple devices, right? We can take the benefit of the devices to maybe use biometrics in the device, maybe store the keys in the TPM chip. So these options are available, and um, passwords are stored in the server, where chances of getting leaked, even a hashed password getting leaked, is very, very risky for any organization. Whereas passwordless options, like maybe using your biometrics, these are not stored in your server, these are local to your device. So it's much easier to manage the security of such. uh, Being passwordless is more secure, is what I wanted to say. But I think we all are aware that we don't like passwords. Companies have to spend billions of dollars to manage passwords with the service desk for password reset. But then they're still there, right? So something is wrong, right? It's not easy to get away from passwords for anyone. Also, a lot of company MFA is good, but they feel that maybe having a MFA for your privileged users, they are secured enough. But I would like to challenge that, right? Is MFA enough along with your passwords, right? uh, what about the process of getting the token or the code? If that's SMS, it's more risky these days, right? COVID has proven us how SMS and then phone can be a threat point uh, for security breaches. Now, MFA is also one time, right? You enter the code, and I've seen that for the day, throughout the day, your session is protected, and you are never asked about an MFA again, right? And then it does not, also social engineering and phishing attacks does, MFA may not be a substitute there. So what I'm challenging that is, while MFA is good, maybe 2-factor, 3-factor authentication is good, but is that enough, right? Also, what organizations are doing is, especially for privileged users, they only authenticate at the time of login. Is that right? Right? Does the responsibility of authentication ends when the user signs in? These are something which I want to introduce some thoughts in you, right? We are running a privileged access program to protect ourselves from insiders, right? The insiders can easily log in, right? There is no, um, the authentication process will not stop it. But what should we do in order to trigger an alarm in between the session, right? That's our focus area. So what my suggestion is, look beyond passwords. Please move beyond passwords. Biometrics, keys, context based authentication are the next step. And some of the benefits is, people like it. Uh, People hate passwords, but biometrics are loved by everyone. It's easy to use. It can be managed at scale because they are stored in your device and not in a server, right? So they are managed by the users themselves, not by a service desk. And they have an inherent MFA. What do I mean by inherent MFA? So if I have the device, right, I so what is multi-factor? Multi-factor is something you know, something you have, or something you are, right? So if you combine two of these, or one or more, not one, two or more of these, then it's called multi-factor. Now, if I have my device, so I have one factor, and then if I enter my biometrics, it's again one factor. Or if I enter my pin, that's another factor. So sometimes it has inherent MFA, which reduces a lot of risk within your company. The other topic which I talked about is MFA uh, alone can help, or do we authenticate only once? So what I'm suggesting is, make sure you start collecting context for your users. Please use that context in your authentication decision or authorization decision for your privileged users, right? So what do you mean by context? Context could be what device the person logs in, what location, what timing, right? What pattern of his activities looks like. Is the person doing a different kind of activity in the day? So these are some of the context, right? And then whenever there is a risk, and then you calculate the risk based on these context, right? So if the user is coming from the same device again and again, maybe the risk score is low. But if the user is coming at a different time, maybe the risk score becomes high. And if the risk score becomes high, then you make your system decide, what do you want to do? Do you want to allow, do you want to reject, or do you want to ask for more data, right? So my suggestion is to make sure your privileged users have a context tied to them, and we use that context to continuously authenticate them and decide whether we allow that user in our system. And before, while I am a great believer of MFA and multi-factor, uh, this is not a substitute for MFA, but it's an additional layer. So I would still recommend an MFA is a must, but then have these additional layers for your privileged users, right? Some companies have, if they are extending to their regular users, good enough, but definitely for privileged users, these context will be required in the future. Okay, so this is a very complex topic, but I hope I can convey my message about coarse-grained and fine-grained roles. And what's happening is we generally give excessive privileges by using coarse-grained roles, right? So what do you mean by roles? So roles are a certain set of responsibility or activity which you do, and the access is defined by them, right? So now the role-based access control is a method to make sure you have good fine-grained roles in your system. But then I've not seen a role-based access control program getting successful results because they create role explosions, very difficult to restrict and define access or at refined levels. Uh, Generally, we try to say database administrator means these many accesses will be present, maybe for tables from X to Y to Z, right? But what would be needed is just table X. And but meanwhile, we have given access to the administrator for Y and Z also, right? Which is not correct. We also cannot uh, how do we define cloud, how do we define third party access, right? So that's really gets complex with role based access control, and when we are dealing with coarse grain. So my suggestion here is to make sure we have fine grained access, right? It does follow the least privilege principle, but how do we get to fine grained? That's the biggest challenge, right? So I would say that maybe a policy based access control can help you dynamically think of what the access level looks like for that user at that certain period of time. Maybe uh, maybe context could be used at that time, right? So maybe your authorization will depend on what the fine grained access looks like. And what helps here is it's very easy to scale. You don't have to define upfront what the access looks like, but this is something more dynamic. At the runtime you get to decide what type of the access, and only that access is given to that user. And something called just in time, which I'll come little later, is what I recommend along with your policy based access control. Excuse me. Okay, then I have static accounts, and I talked about just in time, right? So what do you mean by static accounts? Static accounts, any account with a credentials with access definition stored on a server is a static account for me. My point here is, why do we need a account itself? Why can't we get rid of that account? Maybe we create dynamically that account at the time of access and delete that account when the access is done. So let's look at it. Sorry. So I'm from identity and access management team, and all I do is manage accounts, right? I have to make sure their passwords are rotated. I have to make sure these users have the right access policy defined, and then I have to make sure I keep these accounts maintained, healthy, check for inactivity, check reconcile between systems. So that's a lot of work. In fact, all my years I've been making sure that accounts are safe. I'm syncing them properly. I'm removing them if they are inactive. I'm so all I do is around accounts. And I'm very much questioning, why do I need account, right? Why why can't we move towards dynamically creating account? So here it is, just in time. And while we can't do a just in time for all users in your company, but definitely for privilege access. And maybe it needs, before you start moving just in time, maybe take a look of a set of accounts which you want to be just in time from your privilege access accounts, right? You may want to do only a set now, and maybe later expand to all privileged users. So that's a very specific for your company and your organization. So make sure you have only the right access defined in that account at the time of provisioning. And accountability, one person gets access to that account so that we have traceability. And then when we say just in time, make sure your IAM tools and processes are integrated with just in time process, right? So there is an approval workflow required if somebody wants this access at certain time. And then there should be automation in your system to create this account dynamically in your environment. So uh, definitely just in time is the way to go for your privileged users. Now it's a very, very important topic of manual monitoring controls. And I have experienced this in my 18 years of career, that a lot of monitoring is manual. And as critical topic as privileged access, it's definitely not recommended to be a manual process. So let's look at what do I mean by manual. So we struggle between preventive detective, right? We want to we are very reactive in this struggle, right? So we only look at the events. If somebody has used their privileged access, we go, there are triggers in your system which will tell you Mr. X has used access in the Unix environment. Then we go back, check if there is a change which made Mr. X use the access. And if there is no change, then we go back to the manager of Mr. X, find out why did you use the access. So these are some of our monitoring controls. And isn't it's very, very manual. You have to talk to Mr. X manager, you have to reach out to your change management system, find out what the change is about, and may take days and maybe months to find out that somebody used it inappropriately, right? and and just imagine, if you have thousands of privileged user in your environment, how much of these manual activity will go on. And if somebody has to abuse the privilege access, the event would have already been happened, right? What are we doing to stop it? So again, I would like to use context here. So we have to monitor all these activities of the privileged user real time. Any any behavior change from outside of the norm should be triggering, and we should make a decision point to whether allow, reject, or ask for more data, right? So we have to be continuously aware of what's normal looks like and what's the anomaly is, and this has to be automated. And maybe we have to also look at a unified view, right? We have to look from a user perspective, what does his normal behavior says, what does his track record says, and then what activities he has been doing. So all the views should be together built so that we can conduct these decision points and allow the user to use our system. So the very very important point is make sure you have the right context built in. And it's a challenge because context requires a very very efficient automation in place, because it's data, and you when you deal with data you have to make sure you have automation and enough intelligence in your systems to use that context. Okay, this is one of my favorite one. uh, so I've gone to many people, spoken about PAM. I think the first question they ask me is what tool you have to manage your PAM. While I believe tool play an important role, but I think the people, the process, and policies, they play a bigger role in making your PAM program successful. We just can't ignore these three important pillars. While technology is important, is an enabler, but these are your backbones to make your PAM programs very successful. So in my whole experience, I've seen that PAM program is driven mostly from IAM team. Maybe the enterprise is not involved. There is a lot of discussion with stakeholders to make sure their super users start using PAM, and there is a big struggle there. We don't look at the holistic approach. We don't look at cloud. We don't look at application portfolio. We don't look at maybe those social media accounts, right? And then maybe bots account. We don't look at modernization, and then we only care about how to protect the legacy. Now, before we implement PAM, right? How does your change management process looks like, right? Is it efficient enough to refine access level, to maybe look at what processes we can place to protect privileged users further, right? Like I said, broken processes are very difficult to automate. If your processes are not working, how much automation you want to bring, they will break in between, and it will be very difficult. It will be a messed up scenario if your processes are not right. I believe tools are easier to implement, but processes are where the real crux of PAM program is, means, right? And you are changing a culture of administrator using your PAM tools to access your environment or access their daily schedule, or maybe use PAM as their daily schedule routine. So what my suggestion here is, of course, the first is make sure you evaluate risk, you understand and manage all the stakeholders who are involved to make your PAM program a success, especially the departments and the teams who are going to use your PAM program, who are getting affected by your PAM program. You do have to think about them. And then in addition to people, you also have to think about your future, right? Where is your organization heading after 5 years? If cloud is the goal, then you have to work around your solution to manage a cloud environment. You Another big stuff which I want to bring here is tiering, right? So maybe you cannot classify all privileged access same, right? Maybe you have to define tiers in those, right? Maybe you have to define that these are my most critical privileged access, which I have to add additional control to protect them, then these are my next set of privileged access. Maybe I have lesser controls to protect, but these are also important to I make sure there is no failure point there. And the last, maybe I'm okay with uh, you know maybe relatively less controls here, and then manage through that. So maybe you have to talk about tiering in your privileged access, and then it definitely helps in saving cost and making adding value to protect what's really really important. User awareness, we have to make sure we are taking all the help, because believe me, IAM team is not great in user awareness, and we have to make sure we have external help to train people of how we are going to use PAM and how we are going to authenticate, authorize them in our environment. And anywhere where we have weak points or weak spots, and believe me, we will have weak spots in certain areas. Are we having layer of defense there? Are we having other countermeasures there? So I think you have to think as a big process, not just a tool. The tool will have to integrate many other tools with the help of processes, right? So that's my suggestion, is to make sure you look at your processes. So that's what all is about. And I hope in this session you got some information about what PAM program looks like. My suggestion is to make sure you do a risk assessment, look at the holistic approach first before you start your PAM program, and also look for passwordless. It's not that difficult to implement. It's easier than managing your passwords, believe me. And policy based is something which is replacing your pback, maybe not replacing but coming along with your rback model. So maybe something which we can include in your PAM program. And just make sure you get rid of a set of accounts and use just in time, mostly for cloud. If you're trying to protect cloud accounts, just in time could be an approach there. And monitor proactively, automate monitoring, please. We can't monitor every event unless it's automated, and has to be proactive, has to be real time monitoring. And the last one is please have less manual steps in your environment, in your PAM program especially, and please automate everything. uh, that will be the key for your PAM. So these are few points which I have experienced over line, and I'm trying to implement some of these thoughts which I've shared. Like I've said, I've done passwordless, so that's good. And we are also working. Tiering is also a great example which I've used, and it works great. These are some topics which I wanted to share. So I'm open for questions, and if you run out of time and if there are still questions, I can still answer them through LinkedIn, or I'll be around for few minutes in the event. So you can always reach out.